Good afternoon, honorable cabinet ministers, excellencies, delegates, colleagues, and distinguished guests. They put me in a tough spot here. I know that the last panel was very interesting, and now everyone is eager for lunch. So I will try to be as speedy as I possibly can in delivering this lecture. It is my esteemed privilege to deliver this lecture, which honors George Patrick Stewart and commemorates the ceremony establishing his namesake library, which is currently housed at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Today's lecture is part of the ministry's annual commitment to deliver a series on topical issues in recognition of his contributions to the ministry and the legacy of his work in law of the sea, ocean policy, and governance. This lecture will examine the legal aspects of climate change-induced sea level rise, specifically the relationship between rising sea levels, maritime zones, and boundaries. With the limited time available, we will examine the pertinent legal debates, highlight existing and emerging state practice, and consider the path forward. These issues represent critical national policy concerns for all of us, and it is paramount that small island developing states like the Bahamas participate meaningfully in the wider international discussions on the ramifications of these physical changes on law of the sea and ocean policy. As we have seen and heard, climate change poses an existential threat to our way of life, our economies, our culture, and our societies. It is a threat that is exponentially and disproportionately greater for small developing states, characterized by unique vulnerabilities that diminish our ability to withstand external shocks. This much has been well established. As our oceans warm, we are experiencing thermal expansion, melting ice and glaciers, and changes in land water storage ratios, all leading to what the United Nations has described as an urgent and escalating situation. The warnings contained in the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have been recounted many times. However, it is worth repeating some of them here. The rise of global mean sea level, amplified by anthropogenic activities, is accelerating at an alarming rate, tripling since 1901 and rising at a rate faster than any preceding century in at least 3,000 years. Due to relative sea level rise, current 1 in 100-year extreme sea level events are projected to occur annually by 2100. That risk is even higher in low-lying coastal areas, where these events are projected to occur annually by 2050. This is according to the 2019 Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate. That is 26 years from now. It is a mind-numbing to reflect on this reality. In the face of this issue, a host of challenges arise with potential consequences for international law and human rights, not least of which is how this may impact maritime jurisdiction and boundaries. Naturally, both states and scholars have looked to the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea for potential answers. After all, this is our Ocean Governance Handbook, which enshrined, clarified, and codified the global legal regime for maritime entitlements, rights, and obligations. Its provisions are considered customary international law. In contemplating our collective responsibility to address the very real challenges posed and how the Convention informs this process, I think it useful to reflect on the role that small island developing states have played in the delivery of UNCLOS. At the dawn of our nation's independence in 1973, the late George Stewart found himself on the precipice of what would become a defining moment in the relationship between nations and their respective sovereign expressions in the world's oceans. In December of that year, when the first session of the third conference began, and countries gathered at the United Nations to continue to negotiate this historic document, the Bahamas was barely 6 months old. One can imagine what it must have felt like, fresh on the heels of independence, to enter the great halls of the United Nations, steeped in history, not all that history necessarily in harmony with the experiences of Caribbean countries. How awe-inspiring, humbling, and terrifying the magnitude of what lay before them must have been. Yet despite the great weight of that burden, the Bahamas recognized the importance of ensuring that our unique physical character would be adequately captured in this writing of history. Decades later, in invoking the tenets of the Convention, we are communicating in the shared language of those provisions. In doing so, we can sometimes forget how we got here and underestimate the immense effort of the hard-fought multilateral miracle that is UNCLOS. In the case of the Bahamas, perhaps we can take our archipelagic status for granted, as if it were a given. This is very much the opposite of what history reveals to us. During the UNCLOS negotiations, the idea of an archipelagic state being a special category requiring a specific set of rules was not a common understanding. It took a coalition of just 7 small island states who did not even refer to themselves by that kind of identifier at that time to demonstrate to the others why it should be so. Now in 2024, 42 years later, we find ourselves once again at the forefront of discussions on what global ocean governance means for our small island nations as rising sea levels threaten our identity and our existence. The Convention defines how zone entitlements, the territorial sea, the exclusive economic zone, are to be measured from baselines, and it outlines the parameters for going about this, drawing or connecting so-called legal base points. In this way, the resulting baseline can be thought of as a legal expression of a country's coast, from which all maritime jurisdictions flow. But what happens when the points used to draw those lines, after having already been declared, no longer meet UNCLOS requirements at some point in the future? It is clear that the Convention did not explicitly contemplate sea level rise, nor the impacts of climate change on maritime zones. Given this, can it address this legal challenge? The International Law Committee in 2012 concluded that the normal baseline is ambulatory, moving seaward to reflect changes to the coast. It would then follow that changes in the shoreline, because of sea level rise or otherwise, would result in changes to the baseline, changes to the coast, from which the territorial sea and other zones are measured. While the Convention, of course, makes provisions for strait and archipelagic baselines, which are legally somewhat different, there is an applied connection within the ambulatory theory, as those points must still have a connection to the low water line. Does this interpretation therefore threaten the very sovereign existence of low-lying and small states, whose base points may eventually become completely submerged? Not everyone finds the ambulatory theory convincing, especially when considered within the broader context of international law, sovereignty, and self-determination. In examining the articles of UNCLOS, it can be reasonably concluded that if a state defines by coordinates its baselines that are legitimate when declared, there's no obligation to go back to underlying criteria to adjust them. In other words, the Convention having not stated otherwise, the coordinates are considered permanent and not subject to review. This is further supported by state practice, whereby we have seen that once states deposit their baseline coordinates with the United Nations, they do not and have not updated them. Indeed, the law does not contemplate a displacement of sovereignty and sovereign rights, as Purcell put it in her analysis, based on the meaningless plunges of water in the wind against the changing coast. Although she was perhaps being somewhat facetious, what she means here is that in arriving at a technical understanding of the physical nature of variable coastlines, the Convention, and by implication the countries that negotiated it, do not suggest that sovereignty be forfeited as a result. The International Law Committee, recognizing the complexity of this situation, and even after having made its ambulatory assessment, established a special committee on international law and sea level rise to further analyze this issue. Among its findings, from a broader international law perspective, treaties establishing boundaries are generally considered as having a special status, including their permanence. Article 62 of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which makes provisions for the termination or withdrawal from a treaty in some cases where there has been a fundamental change of circumstances, does not apply in this situation. Because in a provision consistent with customary international law, treaties establishing boundaries, which would include maritime boundaries in this case, are excluded from this article. The Vienna Convention and customary international law, therefore, support the view that modifying or constantly renegotiating maritime boundaries would create legal insecurity for states if their coasts were in constant flux, leading to potential conflicts and a state of instability with neighboring states. Legal stability necessitates that if a state have negotiated a maritime boundary based on equidistance between their coastal baselines, shifting coastlines caused by sea level rise will have no impact on the previously agreed boundary. The emerging consensus, particularly among small island states, is that while sea level rise may result in land masses falling below the thresholds provided for in the convention, this should not legally impact existing and established maritime zones and boundaries. Highlighting this state practice, the Law Committee's Sea Level Rise group, in its Resolution 5/2018, found that on the grounds of legal certainty and stability, baselines and limits should not be required to be recalculated should sea level rise affect the geographical reality of the coastline. This echoes the sentiments of the court in the Bay of Bengal boundary arbitration, whereby the court expressed that maritime delimitations, like land boundaries, must be stable and definitive to ensure a peaceful relationship between states in the long term. What then of emerging state practice? Oh, I apologize, I was off with my PowerPoint. What then of emerging state practice? In 2021, the Pacific Islands Forum, in its declaration, proclaimed that maritime zones, as established and notified to the Secretary General of the United Nations in accordance with the Convention, and the rights and entitlements that flow from them, shall continue to apply without reduction, notwithstanding any physical changes connected to climate change. This is the so-called fixed baseline approach. The PIF reiterated this in 2023 and called upon the international community to support this declaration and cooperate in achieving its purposes. Building on the foundation in 2021, the Alliance of Small Island Developing States emphatically affirmed that statehood and sovereignty continue and will cease only if another form of expression of the right of self-determination of a SIDS population is explicitly sought and freely exercised by that population. Responding to the ramifications of sea level rise is no simple task. Our expressions of statehood are unaffected by these changes, and solutions must have at their core the maintenance of peace and stability. That being said, there are undoubtedly legal questions that require answers. The governance gaps and regime clarifications that may arise cannot be ignored. The fixed baseline theory, for example, could create additional internal waters, which may cause problems for governance and states being clear on their individual rights. Tackling these challenges requires inclusive conversations and consultations between all states. It also requires that we help one another. The duty of cooperation compels us. But how can this be accomplished? Perhaps one practical way is to support states in their efforts to make their deposits under UNCLOS. Gathering the necessary technical information to express the rights provided for in the Convention is an expensive and resource-demanding undertaking, but it must be done with haste. If there is a lesson to be learned from these discussions, is that states need to move forward expeditiously to mitigate the threat to loss of base points in the future. To this end, technical assistance and capacity building initiatives, which focus on horizontal alignment of objectives, can be another effective mechanism of cooperation. Recognizing the critical importance of the task at hand, in May of this year, the Bahamas co-hosted with the Government of the Kingdom of Denmark and the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security, a Caribbean SIDS-focused capacity building workshop to discuss the legal and technical aspects arising from climate change impacts on baselines, zones, and boundaries. What we learned from this experience is that it's imperative that our voices in the Caribbean help to inform this narrative and that our interests are reflected in the outcomes. It is our hope to continue this momentum by building networks within the region between relevant experts and stakeholders as we continue to engage with our international partners to fortify these networks towards tangible, actionable policies and outcomes. In continuing to consider the legal debates, the competing interpretations, and the feasibility of the fixed baseline concept and other solutions, we should not lose focus of this critical fact. The potential loss of territory by small island and low-lying coastal states has been brought on by actions not by our own countries, but predominantly by others. To suggest that this harm be doubled down upon by denying our expression of sovereignty misrepresents the truth of that harm and disregards the founding principle of self-determination on which the United Nations was built. Moreover, small island states cannot be expected to shoulder the burden of sea level rise alone. Addressing its impacts and risks is a policy imperative and legal obligation of every state. As you may be aware, this topic is being considered and analyzed by the International Law Commission Study Group on Sea Level Rise and within the Sixth Committee of the United Nations, an open dialogue to which many member states present here today have contributed, including the Bahamas. Having recently issued its advanced report, we welcome states to take advantage of the legal work that is being undertaken by the Commission and to add their contributions as appropriate to assist its work. In addition to addressing the matter of maritime entitlements, the Commission is also tasked with examining sea level rise in the context of the protection of persons, an element which this lecture did not address given the time constraints, but which is equally as pressing and critical. The Bahamas looks forward to working together with the global community, which includes our partners present here today, to ensure that policy objectives tackle the threats of sea level rise and the legal frameworks that inform them, but have at their core the objective of the preservation and continuation of statehood and the protection of people. Thank you for your attention. I apologize if some parts of it were rushed, but I was trying to go through it as quickly as possible, and I think we have a few minutes for some questions.
sorry, I have a question. Thank you very much for a very, very insightful presentation. A lot of information there. But I've got a very practical question for you, and any other environmentalists who may be in the room. We hear about the issue of climate change, sea rise, and the rest of it, but what can we as small developing states do practically to either retard this expected outcome with climate change, or change it, or even mitigate it altogether? I mean, what can we practically do? We know that we talk about the industrialized countries, pulling back on the emissions of harmful toxins into the atmosphere. So that's one aspect of it. But as small island developing states, if we were to be called upon to take practical steps ourselves to mitigate these circumstances, what would be your suggestions on how we ought to approach that?
Okay. I'll preface my response by saying that I am not coming from it from the environmental point of view. I think to recall some of the earlier conversations, as mentioned by Ambassador Ali and others, I think engaging with the international community to help them understand our position, which then translates into the partnerships that we engage in, the agreements that we engage in, the interpretation of international law. In this case, for example, there are diverging opinions on, we talk about this whole concept of the legality of baselines that are, or base points that have become submerged. And those are used to draw your baselines and then measure your zones and entitlements. It may seem like a concept that is not an everyday reality or not connected to our everyday reality. And in discussing the legal interpretations of that concept, okay, the Pacific Island states have said that they consider that once they've declared their boundaries, those are fixed. That addresses a number of concerns in interpreting the convention, because that means that the jurisdictions and the resources within those jurisdictions become fixed and they do not alter with time. One way that small island states in the Caribbean can assist with that is to lend their voice to that interpretation of state practice. So within the Caribbean region, we have not made definitive announcements on this issue in the same way that the Pacific Island states have done so. Yes, there was the Oasis Declaration, of which we are members, but I think in the Law Commission undertaking its work now, one of the things it's going to do in finalizing its report is to look at state practice, to look at how states are interpreting the law and what the law means. And if we're looking to secure our maritime entitlements, if we're looking to maintain the resources, we talk about, earlier in this session, the ambassador talked about blue carbon credits. But if your potential resources and what is within your territories in question, then it becomes more difficult to understand how you can leverage those resources. And so I think one of the things that we can do as small island developing states is to, like we did when the convention was being negotiated, ensure that there is a fundamental understanding of what this means for our very existence. Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much. And there was a really hard act to follow, but I hope that everybody has a lovely lunch, and I apologize for taking you away from that. Thank you.
Thank you very much,